All right. So for those that don't know me, my name is Ali El-Hashimi. I am currently a camera artist at Supermassive Games. Um, a quick explanation about the camera artist job title. Camera artist and cinematic artist are interchangeable names at Supermassive. It is called camera artist due to the fact that their games are heavily cinematic driven. So in a way, all disciplines could be considered a cinematic artist. As a camera artist, the role includes being responsible for the camera work and the editing the shots together in a sequence. In filmmaking terms, the camera artist is both the cinematographer and the editor. Or as Denis Villeneuve would say, making poetry with a camera, that's the essence of what I do. At any other studio, I would just be called a cinematic artist. For the sake of this presentation and to keep it as broad as possible, I would just be using the term cinematic artist. What's coming within the next hour? So, a presentation about Ali's artistic journey, thoughts on photography, film, cinematics, and everything in between. Screening of the House of Iron and Still short film and director's commentary. This is the short film that I did with Alec Tucker. A tour of the sets from the short film in Unreal, and then at the end Q&As. The opening statement. So this part of, I should preface by saying that this part of the presentation is not a technical breakdown, nor any software will be mentioned. Instead, it will be a story about who Ali is as an artist, the thinking approach that goes into the work. Hopefully, by the end of this, you will not only understand Ali on an artistic and personal level, but the aim is to get people thinking beyond technical execution of a project. What is a cinematic artist? Put simply, a cinematic artist is concerned with the cinematography of a game, or as I like to say, it is a big picture discipline. Cinematics are a marriage of all disciplines. They come together in harmony to tell us a story. In story-driven games, cinematics are the most important element of a game to help us answer one question. Why should we care? But before we go any further, let us backtrack a bit. The artistic journey. The year is 2013. I had just embarked on a 5-year journey to study architecture at the Architectural Association School of Architecture, also known as the AA. Located in one of the best preserved Georgian squares in London, just around the corner from the British Museum, the Architectural Association is the oldest independent school of architecture in the UK, founded in 1847. It was here that I began to develop my artistic sensibility and what my interests were. We were taught how to think critically and analytically, or in more abstract terms, about art and the world around us. This way of thinking was drilled into us for the next 5 years. It was never about teaching us architecture in a traditional way, but instead it was a place that encouraged new ways of thinking. So much so that a lot of the references we were given was not a list of architects or buildings. Painting, film, photography, music, fashion, video games, food, the list is endless. Everything and anything could and can be architecture. One of these references was The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan. And there was something about this film, especially this scene in particular, that made me realize just how performative, dramatic, and powerful architecture can be for storytelling. The beautifully proportioned space, the grid-lit ceiling, the ramp at the far end that creates a sense of endless darkness, the way the ceiling dims down a few rows at a time as Bruce and Alfred walk towards the entrance/exit. In some ways, the modernist architecture in this film is a far more accurate portrayal of who Batman is as a character. The use of the grid represents Batman's obsession for order and control, a brilliant subversion of the Gothic aesthetic we usually associate Batman with. The only job that was ever of interest to me other than filmmaking is architecture. I am very interested in the similarities or analogies between the way in which we experience a three-dimensional space that an architect has created and the way in which an audience experiences a cinematic narrative that constructs a three-dimensional reality from a two-dimensional medium, assembled shot by shot. I think there's a narrative component to architecture that's kind of fascinating. It is no coincidence that Nolan has a deep interest in architecture. Film and architecture have a lot of similarities, as Nolan explains. He's not the only director who explores this. There are several others. I will be mentioning a few film references later on that have been a big influence on my work and the short film that was made with Alec Tucker. Architecture was not limited to the built environment around us, but could take on many forms, giving us so much artistic freedom and time to develop our artistic sensibility, what we liked and disliked. For me, it was about storytelling, exploring the relationship between film and architecture, which led to other things like photography and eventually the filmmaking aspects of video games, cinematics, what it takes to be a cinematic artist. A cinematic artist is responsible for a game's cinematography, or in other words, the camera language used to tell the story. What is meant by camera language? Is the game being shot with prime or zoom lenses, or a combination of both? Is the game being shot so that it looks like one continuous take? And the most common example is God of War. Is the camera locked off on a tripod to create well composed photographs? Is the camera constantly moving with the characters and the action? Is the camera movement smooth or handheld documentary style? The list goes on and on. And in terms of what a camera artist should possess, in terms of skills, a sharp eye for composition slash framing, an understanding of how to block and stage a scene, and this refers to blocking and stage a scene refers to how characters move and interact through a space. The diagrams above from God of War show Kratos, Atreus, and Freya interacting with each other. The complex nature of the movement in this scene is dictated by the no-cut camera used. If this scene was to use cuts, then the movement would be more fragmented. The staging of a scene depends entirely on the type of camera language being used. Being able to understand how to approach a scene spatially becomes important because it can be easy to confuse your audience if the shots don't cut well together. This is one of the reasons why the edit needs to be effective. And this brings us to the third point. Editing shots together produce an effective sequence that pushes the story forward. Cinematic lighting, this includes both character and environment lighting, the ability to think critically and have an emotional awareness within storytelling. In short, a cinematic artist is a multidisciplinary job that requires having an understanding of editing, cinematography, and directing. If you truly wish to understand what is possible in films, whether from the story or cinematography aspect, then pulling from a century worth of film history is a far better alternative than just watching new films only. In some ways, the limitations they had back then made for more interesting shots and stories. The camera was either panning, tracking, or fixed onto a tripod, so the staging of shots had to be perfect. It had an almost theatrical quality to it. Here are a few examples from some of my favorite films. Shadow of a Doubt by Hitchcock. Hitchcock, also known as the master of suspense, was known for using architectural details like doors, windows, stairs to build tension, the prolongation of events. His female characters were intelligent and always so well dressed, creating a sharp silhouette that emphasizes the femme fatale aesthetic usually associated with film noir. This film is Hitchcock at his most purest, the glamour of his other films stripped away, and what is left is a small-scale domestic thriller. If you want to understand how to manipulate tension in a story, then Hitchcock is the best reference for that. He would use camera movement and editing to mimic a person's gaze, turning the audience into voyeurs. Or as David Fincher would say, I think people are perverts. I've maintained that that's the foundation of my career. Hitchcock exploited this as much as possible. He would frame shots in a way that would maximize fear and anxiety. Because of this, Hitchcock became the biggest influence on the story Alec and I were trying to tell with House of Iron and Steel. More on that later. Second film that I would recommend people to watch is The Night of the Hunter. This film is a bit of an obscure one that the average moviegoer will not be familiar with, a dark fairy tale masquerading as a film noir, told from the perspective of two children. Its use of high contrast lighting and deep shadows is heavily influenced by German Expressionism. This film was another reference for House of Iron and Steel. Alec and I wanted to try and push the shadows as far as possible, especially for the farmhouse exterior scenes, not only to create highly abstract shots, but to give the atmosphere a sense of dread. The Night of the Hunter went on to influence many directors, the Tragedy of Macbeth being the most recent example, directed by Joel Cohen. Games are also inspired by these older movies. This shot from God of War is a homage to this shot from Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles. The reason why I bring up these old films is that it's important to understand and pull from tradition when making art. Contemporary films are not made in a vacuum, they build upon what came before. What better way to understand the language of cinema than through looking at the work of the old masters? The traditional fine arts and theories about cinema will always be true. This technology enables you to do amazing things, but the roots come from the traditional core understanding of composition and light and order theory dating back to the Renaissance days. You can't shortcut that when you begin your foray into the creation of synthetic imagery using digital tools. These tools always evolve, but your core artistic understanding needs to be based on tradition. With that being said, let us take a look at composition, one of the most important elements in photography and by extension, cinematography. Given the broad nature of cinematics, I will only be focusing on composition for this presentation. A different way to approach composition, the importance of abstraction. There are still some people who make fun of the fact that you're taking virtual pictures in the game. If you keep taking pictures even in game, your sensitivity and skills will naturally improve. Composition, layout, focus. Most importantly, you will know what you want to photograph. After that, the in-game experience will surely come in handy when you shoot with a real camera or smartphone. In some ways, photo mode is far more difficult than actual photography, especially story-driven linear games where every visible angle of an environment and character interactions are heavily art-directed. The challenge then becomes, how does one photograph a space that is already staged for a camera? Using my own photographs of The Last of Us Part 2 as a case study, we shall look at how to approach two different scenarios. Minor spoilers ahead. Scenario 1. One of the strongest aspects of the game is Ellie and Dana's relationship and the banter that occurs during gameplay. Approaching the scene with a certain level of abstraction, we can break down Ellie and Dana's relationship into several elements. We only need one or two of these elements to make a successful photograph. One example of this would be to look at how characters are defined beyond their physical features, what they wear, how they walk, how they talk. All of these elements come together to build a fully fleshed out character. This might be one way to approach it, or this. We can clearly define which characters are in this shot since all the main cast have very distinct clothing. Ellie wears Converse shoes and Dana wears boots. By attempting to exploit this, we can create photographs that are outside of heavily scripted gameplay moments like the giraffe scene in The Last of Us Part 1, allowing us to look at the game and their relationship through a new lens. So thinking in abstract terms, we're using the shape of the horse to frame their legs to create a frame within a frame. We move the camera until the outline of the horse plus Ellie and Dana's legs create a nice shape or graphics. This is the key to a good photographer, to show the world through their eye, one that reveals new parts of an already existing world, to show us something that we never knew existed until that photograph came along. Photo mode allows us to sharpen this eye, to focus and know exactly what we want to photograph, as Kojima mentioned. This, in my opinion, is what separates a good artist from a mediocre one. Scenario 2. The Pinnacle Theatre in Seattle. Breaking down this space to its essence, we notice several things. Repetition of the seats, light gradient that's caused by the repetition of the seats, the grand scale, decorative wall and ceiling panels. This might be one way to approach it, or this, or this. So using a longer vocal length, we're able to squish or flatten the seats. By doing this, we abstract the seats into a pattern. It's almost as if we're removing them from their original context and giving them new meaning. If we wanted to go wider for an establishing shot, then the same process of abstraction applies to exaggerate the lines and shapes of the theatre as much as possible. So to recap, two things to remember when approaching composition are: rule of thirds and golden ratio does not automatically make good composition. They are a decent guide, but they don't work all the time. It's all about shapes and how you arrange those shapes in a graphic way. This will allow you to make far more interesting and unique compositions going beyond the typical. When photographing or filming a space or character, whether real or virtual, always approach the scene with a certain level of abstraction. This is the key to good composition. This approach towards composition can work in any scenario. If we take a look at a completely different context, it will help us understand this way of thinking better. This was one of the ideas Phoebe initially had in mind for the thumbnail of a Snow White miniatures project. And then after asking for some advice in terms of composition, this is what we came up with after. So after applying this process of abstraction, the thumbnail layout is in a far better state than it was before. With composition, it's always about simplifying as much as possible. The composition on the left does not work because they're still being treated as individual elements rather than something that is part of a bigger picture. The one on the right is far more effective because the shapes are organized in a way that when brought together, they make a cohesive composition. In other words, they make a more attractive shape. You're trained to think in spatial terms and organize volumes in space, which is something I do in my photography. And this is just a photographer who studied architecture and is talking about how his architecture background actually helped him and I guess put him at an advantage when it came to photography because he's already able to think spatially about how to arrange shapes and volumes within a frame. If you wish to understand what is possible with composition, then I highly recommend visiting the Magnum Photos website. Ask yourself when viewing these photographs what you like and don't like about them. Repeat this process long enough and you will begin to develop your own artistic sensibility and how to approach image making. Whether that be photography, cinematics, or any type of 3D work, the same thinking applies. In this day and age when everyone can be considered a photographer because of social media and the overconsumption of imagery on a daily basis, the power of imagery has lost its value. Photojournalism and documentary photography stands above the rest, especially the photographs by Magnum. It is the most powerful form of storytelling in image form. They're able to show the horrors of humanity, but also the beauty, and done with such precision and mastery of composition. This brings me on to my final point about composition. In my opinion, an image becomes striking when there is an absence or abstraction of detail. The stark simplicity of a few elements beautifully composed in a frame is better than the obsession with adding more detail. Here are a few cinematography and photography examples of techniques I tend to use a lot in my work. All of these techniques have something in common. They abstract detail. So the first technique is the out of focus foreground. The one on the left is a film still, and the one on the right is a photography example. The second technique is subjects in motion. And then the third technique is cropping subjects out of frame. Excluding the film stills, if we look at the photography examples again, they all take a similar approach, and that is being obsessed with movement. Subjects coming in and out of frame, what's outside the frame is just as important as what's inside. It gives the photographs life beyond the composition being shown. It's almost as if we've extracted a still from a film. In other words, these photographs have a cinematic quality to them. In conclusion, composition is a very deep topic, one that requires a trained eye to go beyond the cliches of composition. The photographs by Magnum photographers are a good example. Because of this, they've been a massive influence on my work and the approach. And that brings me on to the final chapter. As part of my closing statement, I thought I would include this photograph. To me, this portrait encapsulates the creative process. It's almost as if a daughter is taking a photo with her father. In a way, the filmmaking process is very much like this relationship. If you watch interviews with actors, you'll notice that some will state they look up to the director almost like a father figure. That sense of community is important when making art, finding like-minded people who can give you their unbiased opinion and exchange ideas with. For me, one of those people is Alec. The project House of Iron and Steel was born out of our love for endlessly discussing ideas and having the same sensibilities. At the end of the day, we are not just 3D artists, we are artists. The tools are irrelevant. What's more important is how we use those tools to express ourselves. That is the true definition of an artist. Treat 3D like any other traditional artistic tool, use it with restraint. Ultimately, the aim of the work, whether personal or professional, is to produce a body of work that explores the human condition, what it means to be human. I'm not interested in doing projects that just work on a purely technical level. What's more important is what the work has to say and how we use art to relate to the world around us. In my case, using cinematics as my artistic medium while intertwining my love of film, photography, and architecture to tell a story. With each project, there is a hunger and desire to keep telling bigger and better stories. This presentation marks the start of that journey. So now I need to just reshare my screen. And for those that haven't seen the short film, I'm just gonna play it back and then we'll go through it again and just I'll talk over it about what we were trying to achieve basically with this. So just sort of give a brief overview of what this project was about. Uh, as I mentioned in the presentation, it was influenced by the film noir genre and the films of the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And a lot of sort of the tropes that are from that genre are used in this film. For example, the ending shot where, the demise of the main character. That's what essentially what happens. And usually in those types of films, the main character always becomes obsessed with a certain thing, and it's usually always a detective who's trying to solve a crime. And then by the end of the film, that usually ends with the character either dying or something bad happening. And so that sense of dread is something we try to capture in this film. And because it's a short film, there's a certain amount of time a limited amount of time that we are given to sort of establish, the story and the character. So what the most challenging thing about this project is not the technical execution, it's the edit of of the short film, how it like flows together, the story and what you're trying to say. That is always the most difficult part. And I think when Alec and I were trying to do this, we just spent hours on a call thinking about how a shot transitions from the next shot, rather than, oh, I have this issue in Unreal, how do I solve this? But so essentially, we had to sort of a few shots, we had to establish what the story is, right? So like the opening shot is sort of an industrial wasteland set outside LA. So this film is set in LA, essentially in the 30s. And so this is our establishing shot of the short film, and then we need to find a way to establish the character or the detective at the same time. So this shot is a shot of his office desk, essentially, and this photograph is basically, so the whole story is about the killer leading on this detective until it leads to his death, essentially. So the idea with this shot is that the detective finds this photograph of the farmhouse, which we can assume is the killer's photograph, basically. So he finds that, he becomes obsessed with this idea of investigating what the farmhouse is and what's inside it. And then what we do is, to establish the farmhouse, we don't want to cut to a wide, we wanted to start with a more abstract shot of the farmhouse, just to give it, I guess, more ambiguity, more mystery. And then we cut to a wide shot of the farmhouse and the detective in his car arriving, essentially. And yeah, detective leaves the car, and the idea here was, we didn't want him to go straight into the house, because the idea with films is that you're trying to build up the tension for as much as possible. So the idea of prolonging events is really important. So rather than have him go through directly into the house, we needed a distraction or something that would take his attention away from this front door to the side of the building, so he diverts that way. And that is essentially what makes I think, in my opinion, what makes the tension of this film successful, is that prolongation of events or scenes, essentially. So here we're just building up the atmosphere, and then what draws his eye is this fabric here, which is just waving in the wind, and we can assume that this is, the killer's truck or whatever. And then the detective goes to investigate, and then he finds inside just equipment that the killer uses, basically, essentially, to decorate his victims when he kills them. And we sort of used title cards because we were because we were trying. So essentially, the soundtrack is actually a combination of multiple soundtracks by Johnny Greenwood, and we needed to find a way to sort of have them flow into each other properly. And there were a lot of gaps. So one way we decided to, like, okay, how can we solve this? We would add title cards in between the stories, in between the sections of the story, basically. And then, yeah, he goes to investigate the back. He sees sort of, I guess, the killer's activities, or like how he lives and stuff like that. And then here we're just trying to build the tension through the placement of the furniture. And then we go upstairs, and here we're about to see the dead body where the killer leaves. And this is, so as I was saying before, the detective leads on the killer, sorry, the killer leads on the detective, and he finds a photograph just hanging there for detective to see, and that photograph is hinting at the junkyard where the killer goes to like collect resources and things like that. And then this is the shot of the victim's body with like all the um uh, materials that he uses to decorate it, basically. And then the detective goes to investigate this place, the junkyard, and he finds out that it was a trap, and the killer essentially kills him, or maybe not. I mean, we kind of cut before the gun is triggered. Now I'll just jump into Unreal. Did anyone have any questions while I load Unreal? All right, hit me with a few, man. Hit me, hit me. Uh, yeah, that's a good question. So I think I mean, the thing is, I don't know how much I can say because this is getting into work territory. But yes, there are certain things that are different. For example, in cinematics, you need to be in a game, you need to be able to transition, especially nowadays when cinematics are all real time. So there's a seamless blend between cinematics and gameplay. And usually, when you end a cinematic, that shot needs to be able to blend perfectly with the gameplay. So, like, in terms of character staging and like camera, it needs to be framed in a way that the transition from cinematic to gameplay isn't so jarring, essentially. Oh, that's an easy one. Don't overdo the camera shake. I see a lot of films overdo it, and actually, I would say even the virtual production studios that have been producing short films, that is the issue, right, with Unreal. It's Unreal has all these amazing features, and it's easy to get really excited about it and try to push everything to like 100. But as I said in my presentation, the most successful art or 3D art in general is done by using restraint, being more subtle about your approach. And I think that's, yeah, the most important thing is just being restrained about it, and don't overdo the camera shake. Camera shake, there's a good camera shake, and then there's a bad camera shake, and it always needs to suit the story or the state of the emotional state of the character, essentially. Yep, I mean, yeah. Yeah, just continue. Hmm. Yeah, that's a good one. I need to think about that. Uh, I mean, I think overall, I think it definitely comes down to having an extremely good eye. I mean, because with cinematics, all it matters is the image at the end, right? And it's like you need to that as I mentioned in my presentation, you don't just look at games, look at all kinds of art, film, photography, painting, fashion. Go to galleries, look at them, absorb the paintings, like ask yourself what you like and don't like about them. And if you do that for long enough, then you start to develop an eye, and you start to understand what you like and what you don't like. Because my approach to composition is, could be completely different to what you might want to do, right? And for me, when I was studying architecture, I spent those 5 years just obsessing over films. Just like what I would do is I have an entire hard drive just dedicated of like film stills. So once I was done with like a film, I would just extract the movie as a film still, and I would just watch the movie 100 times just through the form of film stills. And once I started doing that process over the years, I just started to develop a taste or a very specific taste or aesthetic. But in terms of what is really hard to recreate, I would say probably I don't know. That's a tough one. I would say maybe lighting can be a bit tricky because Unreal is still a game engine at the end of the day, and it takes quite a bit of work to get something to look cinematic, right? And I think if I mean I don't yeah I mean if I talk about let me just talk about Alex's work. I mean he probably hates me for saying this, but the reason why Alex's work I think looks so cinematic is because he's not relying on just in-engine tools to make the final image. He's relying on post, adding film grain, adding the border that curved border that you might have on like his project he did of the landscapes, Nocturne or the West. So yeah, I think just using the tools with restraint, just going out there and exploring all kinds of art, and that will help you develop your eye, and that will help you understand how to translate traditional art into scenes in Unreal, essentially. Right. So I think the way I approach it is that the main sort of components of a shot should be done in engine. For example, lighting. You shouldn't be, in my opinion anyway, you shouldn't be trying to add lights in post. The only thing you should use post for is grading and spicing up like the actual sort of imagery of the shot, right? Like the color grading, and also if you wanted add grain. So I think you should try and do as much as possible in engine, right? So like think of it like directors like Nolan or like Tarantino or whatever. They always like to shoot practically as much as possible. So the way I approach it is kind of a similar thing, and the only thing you should be doing in post is just to take a project that is already 95% sort of complete visually and just push it to that 100%. So yeah. Hmm. Yeah. I think for this project, well, firstly, this project actually took about a year if I count the time when I first proposed to Alec that we should do a project together. And we spent like the next few months just discussing ideas and the type of story we wanted to tell and things like that. And then we eventually started a reference board with like images for movies, paintings, all kinds of stuff. And in terms of rough sketches, I mean, because the short film uses existing assets mostly, the only custom work that was done by Alec, like additional texturing and shaders, or if we needed an asset to be more dirty, then that was done from Alec's side. I think in terms of sketches, no, we did not. We did do so something I did do. Maybe if I can find it, I will show it. Let me just check. Can you guys see this diagram? Jill, can they see it? Okay, great. So instead of storyboarding, what I like to do when I start a short film is make a tension diagram. And this was actually inspired by how Journey, the game, did their approach to storytelling. So the black bars just represent the intensity of tension throughout the story. And as I mentioned in my presentation, Hitchcock is probably the best when it comes to manipulating tension. And in my opinion, the most important thing in a story is how a director or someone who writes a story is able to manipulate that tension throughout the story essentially, and how you use that tension to basically evoke certain emotions. So as a starting point, what I did was I made this sort of tension diagram that was actually based on a very specific soundtrack that we did not end up using by an Italian composer. I can't remember his name now, but he works all the time with Tarantino. And here I was basically trying to figure out sort of the pacing of the story, and how, like, where are the story beats, where are the most intense moments that are happening in the story. And then this, I feel like, for me, is a better approach than storyboards, because storyboards, I like Unreal because, because of its real time nature, we can explore composition shots and stuff like that. Like, I love having like 100 cameras in a scene just to explore as much, sort of potential in terms of composition. I think that's the most fun part about Unreal. But for me, I think, if you want to understand story, then I think this is a better way to try and do it. And this is something I've been doing with other films as well, like how to analyze stories. I just draw a tension diagram, and the red is basically the climax. And the thing with stories is that the tension should always be rising. But as you get to a certain point where the tension is at its limit, then it sort of resets and then it builds up to an even higher tension that was before Act One. And then it gets to a point where it keeps going until it reaches the red, which is the climax. And then after that is the wind down to the ending, essentially. Yeah. Yeah, I guess what I meant is that when you look at a scene, or like I don't know, a space in real life, uh, it's about essentially boiling it down to its essence, right? Like when you see a scene, or I don't know, I'll give you an example. Say I'm driving and I just, see a tree like standing on its own on top of a hill, right? Like what, to me personally, why is that attractive to me to take a photograph of, right? So in my head, I'm breaking it down, right? It's like the loneliness of the tree just being there on a hill, by its own, will create a sort of striking image. And the only way you were able to know that is, as I said before, is that you need to train your eye to look at art, traditional art. I'm emphasizing traditional art because that's important. You need to just absorb as much of that as you can. And then at a certain moment, you will begin to understand what you like and don't like. So a lot of my photography and sort of the shots that I do in cinematics is all based on a feeling rather than me trying to over explain why this composition works rather than another composition that doesn't work. It's like when you ask, I don't know, say the Coen brothers, right? If you look at their interviews, they always hate trying to explain their movies because they're never really thinking like that. It's always based on a feeling or an emotion or on intuition. And the only way you can build up your intuition is through looking at art and just, making a visual library reference or however way you want to do it, whatever works for you best. I think that I think that is my I don't know how else to answer that question. It's more just based on a feeling, and abstraction just means just essentially just boiling down a scene into its essence, the shape of it, and like, yeah, I think, yeah. So the diagram that I showed, the tension diagram, that is the way I usually approach my projects. And actually, maybe I don't want to share too much about my next project, but for that, what I did, I took a different approach for that. I started with a soundtrack because me and Alec talk about this a lot, about just the process of like approaching cinematics. And what Alec likes to do is always pick a soundtrack first, find the soundtrack that sort of suits the mood that you're trying to go for, and go from there. And that's something that I realized when I did the project with Alec, is that because we're not using dialogue, or we're not using real actors to like push the story forward, then the music is going to become super important. So for me, for my next project, I've already like chosen the soundtrack, and what I've done is that I basically gone into like Premiere, put that soundtrack into Premiere, and then found images or references from photography, whatever, that sort of match the type of shot I want to go for, and then try to edit that to the soundtrack. So what I'm basically essentially creating is a storyboard, but not a traditional storyboard, right? I'm creating a storyboard that is sort of more in a video format. So, you have a whole series of photographs that are edited together with music, and that essentially gives you the heart of the story and what I'm trying to achieve, and that makes it more easier. So when I go into Unreal, I'm not just lost, like, what the hell am I doing? Like, but essentially, you've already figured out the story, and all you have to do is basically make the thing, and that's pretty much it, because you've already figured out the edit. And as I've said before, the hardest thing in cinematics is not the technical execution, it's the edit of the story, because that is what is going to grab the audience's attention, essentially.
All right, we have one final question, and then I hope your Unreal is booted up. A
Yes.
last one from Noor, slightly vague question, but do you build the environment around the camera or the camera around the environment?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that is a heated topic of mine. I think it depends. It depends on the project. Usually, I prefer to build out a space. Because I come from an architectural background, I like to build out the environment as a real space and then pretend I am a photographer going into the scene or a cinematographer going into the scene, and like I put quote unquote location scouting like an actual filmmaker. So I go in and then where do I think I can place the camera. So it usually depends. I think for the project I did with Alec, it was a mixture of both. So like for example, from the farmhouse set, that was basically just we just literally stole that from the marketplace basically, and we just plopped it into a map. And what I did was I just emptied all the set dressing inside, and because we needed it to suit the story more, right? So we kind of already had sort of a landscape, and so we were kind of already there with having like a fully fleshed out environment. And then because of the ambition of the project, it was like a 4-minute short film. We didn't have time to try and build out everything because then it would just burn us out. So what we did was we just placed in the farmhouse, we just placed where the cameras were, where we think they were going to be for the story. And then once we nailed down the edit, then we go in and develop the shots to the sort of final polished stage. I will say that the junkyard sequence at the end is designed, yes, for the camera mostly. So for that, Alec was the one who did most of the work for that environment. We started with an establishing shot, the one that you see the detective walk into. We built it based on that shot, and then after that, we would go in, and whenever we had other shots that we needed to do, we would just polish up. So I would say it's a mixture of both, and it also depends on the project. If it's a smaller scale project, I would just build out the entire environment. I think that's a much for me anyway. That's how I would approach it. Yeah, and yeah, I can just jump into Unreal now. Um, can they see this, Jill?
Yes, they can.
All right. So here's some behind the scenes from our project. So this is, I mean, I don't really have much to say about this. I mean, if there are specific questions about, the set or the environment or how we approach something technically, then I'm happy to answer that. But I don't really have much to say. I just thought it would be interesting to show some of the behind the scenes for this project, essentially. So this was the farmhouse, and as I said before, we didn't want the detective to go straight into the front door because, as I said, it's about manipulating the tension and keeping that as high as possible for as long as possible. So I had this idea, what if we make him go to the side? And the only reason we were like thinking about that is because when we were location scouting sort of this set, we were looking for like really interesting compositions. And one of the first compositions I had was I wanted basically a shot like this on the ground looking up to show sort of the scale of the farmhouse. And I thought that was a really nice sort of shot that we could use. And so what we did was we needed a way for the character to become distracted essentially. So we had a sort of a moving cloth here, and that idea that essentially makes the detective go around the corner to investigate. And so if we go inside, yeah, so all of this set dressing is done by us. We just emptied what was existing, and all of this is basically just trying to show the killer's activities essentially. And this is like his workplace. We had this idea that this character is sort of like very restless because a lot of the sort of traits in film noir, like the characters are really tortured, and they just never they can never rest easy. So we had this idea like, what if he's just sleeping on the floor instead of like on an actual bed, right? And the whole idea with the farmhouse is that in film noir, there's this idea of you know, the domestic, right? Like a house. If you ever watch those films, you like there's always those films always tend to have a rejection of the domestic. I don't know if that makes sense, but like they reject the comfort of a home because the characters are super restless because of, it could be they're obsessed with a certain case if it's a detective, or it could be, I don't know, the anxieties of modern life, because a lot of film noir is basically a commentary or basically on capitalism and, office life and things like that. So we try to sort of bring that restlessness to the farmhouse. And then if I just go upstairs quickly, um, yeah, and then this is, where the killer leaves the body, essentially. And the whole idea is that the killer photographs the victims as well. So that's why there's a camera there. If we move on to the junkyard, yeah, so this environment was designed for that wide shot, essentially. You can see it's like super simple, just a lot of placement of cars, debris, and whatnot. Um, yeah, and then the other shots were just, yeah, I guess the other stuff was just based on, what the other shots needed to show, basically. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. If there are questions about the Unreal stuff, then I'm happy to answer, but yeah.
Kem had one question. He asked if it would be possible to show the sequencer for one of the shots.
Oh, yes, yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Let me just try and find it. I will show a very simple one. So, let me just check. I will show this one. Or maybe I'll show a few because I still have a bit of time. So, so for this one, so what we did was, this is actually what I did. Um, I found this pack on Marketplace that I thought would really suit the story that we wanted. It's just this 1940s sort of office. And what I did, because with cinematics, it's not about, making your own assets or being obsessed with detail. At the end of the day, it's about the bigger picture and what you're trying to say with the work. So what I did was I literally just took the example map from this pack and just scouted a location within the office, and I found this desk. And the only addition we did to this was add the photograph, add the gun, and add the ashtray. And that was it, literally. And just compose it so it looks nice in a frame, and then add a spotlight outside of the window just to give it sort of that, the shadows of the Venetian blinds just on the photograph to frame it nicely, and also give it that sort of very typical aesthetic you see in noir. And in terms of lighting, it's very simple. Just the idea was we wanted to use the shadows to frame the farmhouse in the middle, and also just to have some highlights on the gun. So if I just turn off the lighting, I can show you what I mean. So you see that, just a simple rectangle light, just to have the gun, just have the gun catch, some really nice highlights on that. And yeah, spotlight. Yeah. I can show a more sort of complex. Let me find a really sort of difficult shot. Um, One thing I do want to say about camera work in Unreal is that if you go in, so the key to good camera work is the curve editor, and simply just keyframing stuff in the transform here that you see is not good enough, because you're going to end up with a lot of messy keyframes. And the idea for realistic movement is your curves need to be as smooth as possible. So in this shot here, which is the only shot that uses sort of more curvy movement, it needs to be smooth. Otherwise, it's not going to be realistic. If you have like really sort of really sharp curves or like the curvature is a mess, then you need to go back in and clean it. And that is essentially the most important thing when it comes to camera work in Unreal, and also using the least amount of keyframes, because using it's essentially just keeping it as simple as possible. That's the most important thing um, with camera work, essentially in animation in general. Um, Let me see if I can find another shot to talk about.
Would it maybe be better if we answer the rest of the questions first?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay,
I didn't know
cool.
there were more questions, so feel free to, yeah.
There are currently four more, and we have around
All
six
right,
minutes
sure.
left. When lighting a scene, how far are you willing to stretch from reality in order to convey a mood that you're looking for, rim lights, etc.?
I would say as much as possible to a certain extent, because I think the way me and Alec like to approach lighting is in a very practical way, right? So, I'll give you an example. For example, this shot here of the living room slash kitchen, um, most of the light sources are coming from the window, but it's not a directional light. It's just a spotlight that is just aimed at the window, and it's a very sort of, I would say, a very Roger Deakins approach. If you look at his work, it's very, yes, it is beautiful, but at the same time, it's very naturalistic and realistic. There's not, basically, the way we approach it is that we have to justify why the light is there. We can't just plop a light inside if there isn't an actual light source there to light it. For example, a lamp on a table. If you have that, then yes. Like, to give an example, say you had a character sitting on this couch, but you had no lamp here. It wouldn't make any sense to sort of try to light it like that. It would make more sense to try and light it with window light. Or if you did have a lamp on the table, then yes, it would make sense. So I would say, yes, you are faking it, but at the same time, you're trying to be realistic in terms of, yeah, I guess just don't overdo it. It's sort of like, I had a really good example, but now I've forgotten. Yeah, I can't remember now. Sorry.
No worries. How was the workflow of you and Alec working together at the same scene? Thinking it was from your personal PC, I assume you didn't had a production level source control. I'm curious to know how that dynamic worked out, especially with a cinematic there's lots of back and forth.
Right. Yeah. So actually, we did use source control. We used plastic as recommended by Chem, and that was really good because Alec works on a different time zone. So usually the way it would work is that I would go in on the morning or in the afternoon. I would work on it on a bit, and sometimes the evening, and then Alec would work on it late at night. So when I would wake up the next morning, we would already have new work to be seen or like approved. And what we would do is that, so I think by the end we went through like, I think 12 versions of the edit. And what we would do after, because so basically Alec was responsible. So there were certain things that Alec was responsible for. For example, handling all the rendering, because we didn't need both of us doing it, right? So it's essentially he set up the MRQ settings, movie render queue settings, and he just rendered out the shots. When we both decided, okay, we should just render them out for an edit. And then he would, so basically the way it would work is that the edit is actually done by Alec himself, but we would jump on a call, he would share a screen, and we would just spend a few hours just like, arguing, discussing, how we need to structure the shot, or like how we need to structure the story. Where do we need to put transitions? Is the music working? Is this shot working? Is the placement of this character working? Is the lighting working in this? And that's sort of how we did it. So what we would do is we would use something like Sin Sketch or Frame.io. We would upload the edit onto there, and then whenever any one of us had time, we would just put a bunch of comments for each shot, what we wanted, what we needed to do next, and then that's how we sort of did the back and forth. And I will say, I will emphasize that if you do want to do a project with someone, it's always better to find someone that has the same frame of mind as you, or like the same sensibility as you. The reason why I'm really proud of this project is that me and Alec had an amazing time doing this, and I will always look back at the time that we had with this because it was amazing, and we have, it's almost like we have the same brain essentially, because we're always like bouncing ideas off each other, and he would tell me if this idea is shit or not. So yeah, it's a really nice back and forth, right? And both of us are really good at just listening to each other. There's a lot of trust, and yeah, it was just, yeah, essentially at the end of the day, just find like-minded people, right? That's why you have communities like EXP, right? Like find those people, and then if you want to do a project, then do a project with them, and then yeah, have a good time with it, have fun.
Cool. Three more questions. Are
Yep.
the giant emissive planes used for lighting? And if so, are they hidden by angles, or is there a way to hide them in the sequencer?
So yes, I think they are used for certain shots, and yes, you can because it's literally just a plane. All you do is just drag it into sequencer, and let me see if I can find an example. Yeah, so this plane is in sequencer essentially, and all you have to do is go into track. You can either do actor hidden in game or convert it to a spawnable, and then if you click untick spawned, you can hide it and things like that. But if you so thing with this is that if you want to keep it specific for the sequence, convert everything in the sequence to a spawnable actor, and that will keep it just for that sequence. But if you need it for other sequences, then it's always better to go into track and click actor hidden in game. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Cool. It seems like you have a lot of control over the fog. Did you use anything special for it, or is it the default Unreal fog?
Nope, it's very basic fog. I mean, this whole project is literally very basic. Yeah, it's just the exceptional height fog. I think the reason why it probably looks sort of not default is because of the grading and the film grain that we added on top, which sort of spices up the atmosphere. But no, it's very basic fog, and I believe the sky is just a very basic sky. Yeah, just a very basic mesh environment. Yeah, yeah. There's not much to it really. Yeah, it's actually just a HDR essentially. Yeah.
Cool. And the last question: is it possible to see the camera? Oh, sorry, I was muted still. The last question: is it possible to see the camera close-up shot? It looks like the focal length is being decreased and the camera is being moved on the local z-axis to create a static, uncanny effect. Is that correct?
Which shot are you referring to? The camera, the one on the tripod, right? This is that. Are they referring to this shot?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I'm actually I can't remember if yes, it is using it is using a change in vocal length. So it starts off as like a 35 and then ends on a well, kind of a fake lens 52. But I mean that is that is a good observation. I don't think so. That's the funny thing, right? With movies, right? Everyone interprets it differently, and I don't think when we were doing this shot, we didn't really have that idea of like, oh, this is uncanny, right? We were just using it as a way to sort of build tension. Like this is what the killer is using to take photographs, essentially. So I would say that's a really good observation, but we didn't really. That wasn't, I guess, our intention, but I guess it works at the end of the day because film noir is supposed to be uncanny, so I'm not complaining.
All right, cool. Then I think that was all the questions. And that's also the last speaker of the day. Thank you all for coming and watching the talks. Tomorrow we have 5 talks, so if you want to be there, we start an hour earlier than today. But until now, that was it for us from our side. So thank you for joining, and we will see you tomorrow.